All right, so I want to welcome everybody back to Black Studies or African American Studies with me, the forecast, for the 11th session. And if you missed any of the previous ones, then, I suggest you go back and you can watch them all in order. And of course, I got to say, I appreciate everybody who showed me support. I'm not going to lie, these things is hard to do. And I try to make time, but I appreciate all the love and support everybody has shown me. So much love to y'all for that. And of course, I'm going to keep encouraging other people to create their own courses, whatever you think it may be, whatever you feel like we need. I encourage others to go create that, whether it be math, science, business, whatever you think we need to do, learning how to shoot guns or whatever it may be. I encourage you to put together your own course for our children to get us all in the right mindset and on the right path. Now, last time we looked at a lot of rebellions, including, the Brother Mackendall, Queen Nanny, Cuba Cornwallis, Tacky, Apongo, right? Many revolutionaries that fought for our freedom. Now, of course, on the other side of those rebellions, right, we got to talk about that too. But it had white people globally a lot more shook, even though they already had this fear and this white guilt that they had to deal with. Them seeing all of these rebellions taking place globally caused even more white fear and paranoia, afraid that the slaves on their plantation was going to rebel against them or start poisoning them. And, by this point, they was blaming everything on the enslaved population. Well, the black population, period. And whether it was real or they just imagined it, right? They still tried to take it out on black people. Now, in 1793, when a bunch of fires broke out in Albany, New York, or as they call it, the Albany Fire of 1793, some people say the burning of Albany. But during this fire, at least 26 homes and businesses got destroyed. Now, even though nobody knew how the fire started, they started rounding up random black people and interrogating them. And of course, they started enforcing stricter laws and instituting earlier curfews for black people. And this is up north in New York. Now, eventually, they blamed the fire on two enslaved little children, two young black girls. A young sister named Dina, who was 14, and another young black girl named Bet, who was only 12 years old. And without any evidence, they straight up lynched these two young black children, two little girls. And then about a month later, they blamed another 16-year-old boy named Pompey. And, they arrested him and lynched him as well. Now, to this day, nobody knows the causes of the fire. And it was most likely the material they used to build the buildings and the flammable material that they kept around these buildings. But even so, they forced these three young children, three enslaved children, into a false confession, right? And they likely used the tactic of a mock lynching, right? And we're going to talk about mock lynchings, and we're going to see them a lot more later. But they blame these fires on a 14 and 12-year-old black girl and a 16-year-old young black boy, and they lynched them. Now, understand that despite all of this, right, black people continue to fight back and to do anything that they could to get their freedom. And a lot of black people were just simply running away or just escaping, including from the lying slave-owning president, George Washington. Slaves ran away from his plantation all the time.
We've tended to be a little uncomfortable talking about George Washington and slavery. When we think about the presidents who owned slaves, George Washington, as the first president, did indeed own slaves, as did his wife. At the time of his death, there were nearly 300 enslaved people living at Mount Vernon. So he was a large slaveholder. The Washingtons' relentless pursuit of their runaway slave, Ona Judge. She was an enslaved woman. She was born at Mount Vernon sometime in 1773-74, around the era of the Revolution. As Ona grew older, she was expected to learn to be a seamstress, an expert sewer, which she did indeed become. But at some point during her teenage years, she became the preferred slave of Martha Washington. She was tasked with the most intimate of responsibilities. She would help Martha Washington bathe. She would brush her hair. She would sew her clothing. She was there 24/7. She was always present, but really supposed to be never seen, which was the role and the responsibility of what we call domestic slaves who worked inside of the household. So when Ona learns that she's going to be given away to Eliza Parke Custis, a difficult woman, she makes the decision to run. And she leaves the Washingtons' house while they were eating supper, never to return. With the help of friends of the free black community in Philadelphia, she finds her way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And George Washington would spend literally the rest of his life attempting to reclaim her. And Ona Judge, through her own strategic mind, through the help of friends, was able to turn away Washington's slave catchers at every turn. For 50 years, she lived as a fugitive, and we often say that those folks are free who get away from their enslavers, but in actuality, Ona was never truly free. She was simply never caught.
Now, with George Washington, right, he would do anything that he could to retrieve his slaves, but still trying to keep his name clean. No fronting like the lying president does. He was supposed to be strict and violent, and he often threatened his slaves, especially the younger slaves, especially the younger boys. But he often threatened them with violence, or he would threaten to send them to Jamaica. And one time, he told a 15-year-old enslaved boy named Ben, when he got caught fighting, that if he didn't stop, he would ship him off as he did Jack the Wagoneer for the West Indies. Now, when George Washington was trying to track down these quote-unquote runaways, he would often publish an ad for their return. But he usually asked for them not to be shown north of Virginia, I guess to affect his voting or whatever it is.
The enslaved African of America's first president, George Washington, was known as Harry Washington. It's believed that he was born in the region around the Gambia River around 1740. He was brought to America early in the 1760s on one of the shipments to the lower Potomac River area in 1760 and 1761. Late in 1763, George Washington purchased Harry from the estate of Daniel Tebbs, a plantation owner on the lower Potomac River. Harry was later described as a very valuable hostler, so his job must have included looking after Washington's horses. He continued to work as a house servant until June 1771, when he appeared in a list of the enslaved laborers on Ferry Plantation, most distant of the Mount Vernon farms. For Harry to be moved from skilled work to grueling plantation labor must have dismayed him greatly, and perhaps became the motivation for his planned escape. George Washington paid for a search party to retrieve him, and in a matter of weeks, Harry was captured and returned. Ironically, after some time, he was returned to the house to labor there. George Washington spoke openly about Americans asserting their rights, and Harry no doubt heard about disgruntled Virginians during this time. Harry, realizing an opportunity, escaped once again and managed to get the ear of the British, where he offered his services. Harry was absorbed into an all-black army corps called the Black Pioneers, formed in May 1776.
Now, in Georgetown in 1795, an ordinance was passed that outlawed enslaved people from congregating, and if anybody was caught, they received 39 lashes, and their owner was fined $3. And most times, if anybody helped a runaway slave, they would be punished much harsher than that, especially another black person. Now, even though I'm not going to go in too deep on the Haitian Revolution in this session, there is a couple things that I wanted to mention, right, that was happening at the same time. And, you know, just to see the effects that it has on black people in America and globally. And one of the issues that we do need to discuss, now, historically, there has always been a complicated dynamic between the mixed population mulattoes and black people, which played out in America, but not only in America, but throughout the world, including in Haiti. Now, when we was talking about it last time, right, Toussaint and the Haitians had taken over the island by 1796. But the problem is, in Haiti, maybe more so than other places, the mulatto population felt they were in a higher class than black folk. And most of them had been slave owners before the revolution and felt that their slaves should be returned to them. Now, one biracial or mulatto commander, John Louis Vitale, and I'm probably saying his name wrong, but he felt that he should be in control over Toussaint because he was biracial and Toussaint was a black man. And at one point, he even captured a general, one of Toussaint's General Laveau, or I'm sorry again for the pronunciation, and charged him with tyranny just because he addressed the prejudice that darker-skinned Haitians felt. Now, Toussaint did order his release and then named him as lieutenant governor and said he wouldn't make a move without consulting him first. But eventually, the general left the island to represent Toussaint in France. Now, the reason why I mentioned Haiti right here, even though we're going to get into it more on the next session, it was a couple of points that I wanted to make, especially with the mulatto situation. But during this time, this is when the Spanish was forced out of Haiti. But not only that, they were losing ground in America as well, with the British taking over more and more of Florida. And then after John Adams was elected as the second president in 1797, Spain was completely forced out of the area which became Mississippi. Now, as president, John Adams did recognize Haiti and Toussaint as a nation or a power of their own. But John Adams recognizing Haiti terrified people like Thomas Jefferson. Now, good old TJ was afraid and angry because he was saying the energy of the Haitian Revolution was spread globally, and it was going to influence the Negroes in America to do the same thing against them.
As vice president, Thomas Jefferson urged Congress to cut off trade with Toussaint. Black sailors from the island mixing with American slaves in southern ports was a threat that could not be contained, he argued. But the trade was too profitable, and Congress refused.
Jefferson's fear was that black Americans, like Gabriel, would be inspired by what they saw taking place just off the shore of America. And he spent virtually his entire career trying to shut down any contact and therefore any movement of information between the American mainland and the Caribbean island.
In 1801, weeks after Jefferson's inauguration as America's third president, he was visited by Napoleon Bonaparte's representative in America's new capital, the city of Washington. Napoleon, the first consul of France, was seeking Jefferson's help in reimposing slavery in Saint-Domingue. After the meeting, the envoy wrote to Napoleon that Jefferson promised that all necessary measures would be taken to starve out Toussaint and to aid the French army.
Well, it's ironic that despite Jefferson's own hostility to the Saint-Domingue Haitian Revolution, that the signal achievement of his administration was very much based on the success of that revolution.
Now, I don't know where he's been. Black people have been fighting back from day one before him, and they were still fighting back after him. And like I said, we're going to get more into the Haitian Revolution and the effects globally on the next session. But you can see it's causing more and more white fear globally, including in America. Because in America, even in places that talked about quote-unquote abolitionists and all of this stuff, right, they were still procrastinating on abolishing slavery. 1797, New York passed a law saying anyone born to an enslaved woman after the 4th of July, 1799, would be considered legally free. But in reality, those children would still be enslaved until the age of 28 for men and 25 for women. And for the people born before that day, they would essentially be enslaved forever. Right? So if you was born July 3rd, 1799, you'd be a slave. Like for somebody like Sojourner Truth, who was born in 1797. She was supposed to be enslaved for life, even though they just called it an indentured servant.
Sojourner Truth was born around 1797 in Ulster County, New York. Originally named Isabella Baumfree, Truth was sold at 11 years old along with a flock of sheep for $100.
Sojourner Truth wrote about her life as a child in slavery, and she talked about experiencing sexual abuse and continued beatings and whippings by her slave owner.
Truth fled her master in 1826, 1 year before the abolition of slavery in New York, and eventually became a freed slave.
After Truth became a free woman, she had the courage to go to court to challenge the legality of her son being sold into slavery. She was successful against so many odds, which is what makes that court case so amazing.
Inspired by religion, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth in 1843. The following year, she joined forces with abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison.
Sojourner Truth became a traveling preacher, but also she was an early women's rights advocate, and so she spoke very forcefully for that as well.
In 1850, she published her memoirs, and the following year, Truth delivered her famous speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention.
The speech was later retitled Ain't I a Woman? And it was so powerful in part because it talked about the equality of work that was executed by Black people in general, that people who were free and unfree worked just as hard whether they were men or women.
Following the outbreak of the Civil War, Truth recruited troops for the Union Army and met with President Lincoln in 1864, who gave her permission to become a counselor at Freedmen's Village.
Sojourner Truth made a singular contribution during the Civil War. She agitated for Black people to be able to fight for their own freedom.
Truth continued to campaign for abolition and women's rights until her death on November 26, 1883.
Now, of course, we're going to hear a little bit more about the great Sojourner Truth as we move along through these lessons. But it was around that time, around 1797, that free Black people petitioned Congress for the first time. The free Black community in Philadelphia unified and came together to petition the Congress to end slavery. Now you got to understand, by then, that market of kidnapping free Black people, men, women, and especially children was already becoming big, right? And in places like Philadelphia and other places, they would catch Black people slipping, kidnap them, and re-enslave them or sell them back into slavery. And these brothers petitioning Congress in Philly was inspired after 4 Black men, Jacob and Jupiter Nicholas, Joe Albert, and Turner Pritchett, were kidnapped and re-enslaved after they earned their freedom fighting in the Revolutionary War, even though their families were still enslaved in North Carolina.
The elite community in Philadelphia was much different than elite communities anywhere else. I mean, free Black Philadelphia was considered to be the standard. I mean, they were the gateway, is what the word they used for free Black communities. There was a gateway between the North and the South. That enslaved populations looking to work them way up, they would come through Philadelphia. And if they were lucky enough and blessed enough, they can then settle in Philadelphia and help to move the community forward. But what was happening in Philadelphia had been taking place since the 1700s. I mean, this is a community where you had enslaved people, you had this free Black community working side by side. I mean, they were actively involved in building Black Philadelphia. So these were families that had been free for hundreds of years. Families that had been free coming out of the Revolutionary War. I mean, you had some of the wealthiest Black families in Philadelphia. When you talk about the LeContes, when you talk about the Fortes, these are families that had old, established money. They made sure their children were educated and well-traveled and spent time with the right people. They were not just grooming the men. They were also grooming the women. That the girls were educated alongside with the boys. I mean, more boys were educated, but elite families made sure both the boys and the girls were educated because they were told they had to then become leaders and they had a responsibility to giving back to the community.
Now, once somebody is kidnapped, right, usually the state holds them to determine whether they are free or not or whatever the case may be. And then most times the judges got more money to send them off into slavery, right? They might get $5 for letting them go and $10 for sending them into slavery. Like I said, that's jumping ahead in the lessons, and we're going to see that a little bit later. After the Fugitive Slave Act, they held these people. So in a state like Philadelphia, where they claim so much abolitionists were, they claim to be so fair, the black community were outraged that these four brothers were still held against their will, even though they had evidence, even though they had witnesses, they had proof, the whole 9 yards. But Congress refused to even see their petition. And like I said, we're going to keep talking about these so-called abolitionists because we're going to see the truth about who and what they really are. But anyway, after the Spanish left the area that became Mississippi, which included parts of Alabama, there were so many cotton fields, and with the growing demand of cotton, and after the invention of the cotton gin, which we also got to talk about that, how that changed the course of how slavery went. But now that they had control of so many cotton fields, the population went from like 30,000 in 1798, close to 200,000 by 1817. And likewise, the slave population went from about 4,000 in 1798 to over 70,000 by 1817. Now in Georgia, between 1794 and 1798, at least 78% of the slaves brought into Savannah were taken directly from Africa. Almost like they had their own little personal slave trade or something.
But what they didn't tell you, that this is a city where your slaves, not only slaves, but your Gully Indians, which the Yamasee Indians stay too and play. You see, not only did they bring West African slaves from there, but they didn't tell you that Africans built the city. Africans built the city. Okay, Savannah, Geechee, Gullah, Lane. So Geechee is basically Savannah, Georgia area, and Gullah is basically South Carolina, or Geechee is like more Georgia. But in nationality, you call it Gullah Geechee, or you call it Gullah or Geechee, no matter what. But you got to understand that Savannah and Georgia was on Savannah and Charleston was on the coastline, and Brunswick and other like cities on the coastline, even in North Carolina, of course they would be the ones where the slaves would come from. But so the ship called the Wanderer. I know a lot of people say they don't see evidence of that, but this is where someone come from. Savannah involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Of course, they was involved in it. In 1798, the state let us ban it. They banned it this in 1798. They banned it, but they still was sneaking slaves in. They made a law against slavery. They still sneaking them in, still continue. They say all the way to 1858. They stopped in 1798, but it continued to 1858. So other supply zones for Savannah market include the British colony Sierra Leone, and this is the Windward coast of West Africa. And this after the Revolutionary War. The slave trade to Savannah resumed it. They continue it between 1784 and 1798. That's like a 14-year period. I mean, so say West African accounted for 78%. 78. That's a lot of African that are imported directly to Savannah. And I think 24 from the Caribbeans or something like that. Then you had some from South Carolina that they borrowed to help build Savannah.
Now, of course, the South, right, they had all of the things that they had going on. Now, in Georgia, especially Savannah, they're still covering up these mass graves, building towns over top of them. But this also was kind of the beginning of the animosity between some of the southern states and the northern states, because even though the northern states relied on the money they was making in the South, due to things like the Haitian Revolution and all of these other wars, they didn't want to keep importing people. But Georgia was doing it on their own. South Carolina was doing it on their own. And you got to understand, they began to realize that it was easier to enslave a child who has never known freedom than it was to enslave a person who has known freedom and was willing to fight to get it back. Now, in the North, places like Boston opened the first sponsored school for black children, right? Philly had a school where free black children could attend. But even in those communities, right, the free black population would barely deal with the enslaved black population or the formerly enslaved black population, right? They would even separate themselves. Now, like I said, we're going to get to the Haitian Revolution next time. But I did mention the whole issue with mulattoes, right? Because America dealt with the mulatto situation a lot different than other places like France handled it in Haiti. Now, Virginia passed a law to ban any white mother who had a mulatto child from the colony completely. Now, I guess they didn't take white boys raping black women and creating a mulatto class seriously enough to ban them out of the colony or the state. In most cases, they was enslaving their own children. Now, believe me, we're going to touch on some of the cases where they didn't and they accepted those children and how they used them too. So we're going to touch on that. But anyway, America dealt with it a lot different, where France put them in as the overseers. In America, they usually put them in the fields or made them quote unquote house Negroes. But anyway, in 1799, the liar, criminal president George Washington finally died. And in his will, he left his slaves to his wife Martha until she died. Then they were supposed to be set free. Now understand, some of them never got freedom. Most of them were enslaved for decades afterwards. And most of the slaves George Washington and his wife had was his wife's slaves, not his. Now the thing is, this white girl, Martha Washington, started to get paranoid, and she was afraid that these slaves were poisoning her, right? And she sold some of them, which they never got their freedom. But she did release some of them because she thought that they was plotting to kill her.
George Washington died on December the 14th, 1799. Under the terms of Washington's will, his 123 slaves, not including the 40 who were rented or the 154 slaves belonging to Martha Washington, were to be freed upon the death of his wife. The terms of George Washington's will created an almost immediate problem for Martha Washington. The only thing standing between 123 slaves and their freedom was her life. According to a contemporary letter, Martha Washington did not feel as though her life was safe in their hands. The first conviction in Virginia of slaves for the use of poison against their master occurred in 1732 after the death of Ambrose Madison, the grandfather of future U.S. President James Madison. In the early summer, 36-year-old Ambrose fell sick. Poisoning was suspected. The poison did not kill him outright, but caused enough internal damage that he lingered near death for weeks, finally dying in late August in great agony. Within a week of Madison's death, 3 slaves were being held under suspicion of having poisoned the young planter. 2 of the 3 were found complicit in Madison's death, but not to such a degree as to be punished by death. The third, a man called Pompey, the principal conspirator, was executed. Martha Washington's fears of a plot to kill her may have been justified or may have been imaginary, but they certainly reflected the attitudes of slave owners of her day. The closeness of house servants to their masters, for whom they cooked and washed in the very house where the master slept, made the threat of poisoning terrifying. Nor was this fear groundless. The records of colonial Virginia document the trial of 180 slaves tried for poisoning. Martha chose the path of caution and freed Washington's slaves within a year after his death. She never freed her own slaves.
Now, they probably were plotting to kill her and poisoning her and George Washington the whole time. They probably poisoned him. Because sometimes that was the only way they could fight back, was to poison their food. Because why would you have them make your food? But anyway. Now, the rest of the slaves that she did keep ended up getting divided amongst their children. So even George Washington's will was a damn lie, right? As they like to say, he never told a lie, but all he did was lie. Even his will was a lie. But this brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about for this session, because I don't want to make this session too long. But I do think we need to talk about this because most black people realize the only way that they be free was to emancipate themselves, right? And that's by any means necessary. So in 1800, an enslaved man named Gabriel Prosser planned his own rebellion to free him and his people, which was known as Gabriel's Rebellion.
After the invention of the cotton gin, the threat of sale loomed larger than ever before, and laws were passed to keep slaves under a tighter watch. Some resisted by running away, others by stealing or refusing to work. A very few saw no other alternative but to take up arms. One was a slave named Gabriel, who stole a pig and was hauled into a courthouse outside Richmond, Virginia, in 1799.
Gabriel was caught stealing a pig. Instead of accepting the abuse, which of course every slave was supposed to accept, he threw the man to the ground, wrestled him to the ground, and bit off the better part of his left ear. That, of course, was a capital crime. Pig stealing was a common occurrence. Biting white people was something that it was not encouraged for black Virginians to do.
Gabriel was convicted of attacking and maiming the white man who caught him. To deter others from such crimes, he was publicly humiliated, branded, and forced to spend a month in jail. As Gabriel sat in his cell, he decided that the time was right to organize the slaves of Richmond and strike against those who were holding them in bondage.
The only time that slaves would have had any mobility without the most rigid observation of whites would have been on a Sunday, would have been at night. Religious gatherings could have, in some cases, provided an opportunity for people to meet. We must never forget that any kind of move toward liberation among blacks was a question of life and death.
Like all revolutionaries, Gabriel seemed to have very little concern for violence and danger. He was 6'2", 6'3", in a time of relatively shorter men. He was a blacksmith, so he was a man of enormous strength. He was described as having scars on his face. He was missing most of his front teeth, and I suspect that came from mixing it up in the quarters with other slaves. He was a man who people instinctively tended to follow, and he apparently feared very little.
After his release, Gabriel began hammering out instruments of war, turning shovels into swords and molding bullets. Through most of the year 1800, he recruited soldiers for a rebel army.
All the whites were to be massacred, except the Quakers, the Methodists, and the Frenchmen, and they were to be spared on account of their being friendly to liberty. They intended also to spare all the poor white women who had no slaves. Ben Woolfolk, conspirator.
Obviously, he was not a naive man. He realized that this would be black freedom born of white fear, not out of white magnanimity.
1,000 men was to be raised from Richmond, 600 from Ground Squirrel Bridge, and 400 from Goochland. The business of the insurrection had so far advanced that we were compelled, even if discovered, to go forward. Solomon, conspirator.
Gabriel decided his troops would move at midnight on August 30th, 1800, carrying a flag with the motto, "Death or Liberty."
We can imagine what it was like on that day in August in 1800, with scores of African Americans gathering on a Sunday to create this rebellion, with picks and axe and knives and clubs, and what it must have been like for them, prepared to strike and yet unable to strike.
That very evening, one observer wrote, there came on the most terrible thunderstorm accompanied with an enormous rain. Rivers swelled, roads and bridges washed away, and when it became clear that the business, as it was called, would be impossible in the storm, Gabriel tried to postpone the revolt. But before morning, the plot was betrayed by 2 slaves.
What's phenomenal is how close it got. If the accounts and the inferences we can make about the numbers, that it lasted so long before any betrayal is quite extraordinary.
Gabriel went to trial on October 6, 1800. He refused to testify or to explain his actions, but one of the rebels did make a statement.
I have nothing more to say in my defense than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial. I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and I am a willing sacrifice in their cause. And I beg, as a favor, that I may be immediately led to execution. I know that you have predetermined to shed my blood. Why then, all this mockery of a trial?
Now, Gabriel Prosser was born in 1776 during the Revolutionary War, at a time where the energy of revolution was in the air. Even though there was laws about educating slaves, he still learned how to read and write. Now, after he became a blacksmith, he had more freedom to move around than other black folk. And as he moved around the city doing jobs, right, he met and befriended a lot of other black people, or at least became allies with them. Now, Gabriel was enslaved by a white boy named Thomas Prosser, who owned a huge plantation called the Brookfield Plantation. In the area over there, they still call it Brookfield right now. But he often leased out Gabriel Prosser to go work for other slave owners at their plantations. But this gave Gabriel a chance to meet and congregate with other enslaved people on other plantations throughout Richmond and the surrounding counties. Now, one day, Gabriel Prosser, his brother, and one of his friends got caught stealing a pig. Right? And oftentimes slaves were very underfed, and after working all day, some would resort to taking a pig just so they can have something to eat. Most times they were just acting out of desperation so they wouldn't starve to death. But you know what Europeans did? They used that to further the myth that black people just naturally steal. You know, just because they try to take something to eat, they be like, oh, well, see, black people is prone to stealing. Look at this. Even though they literally stole the people and enslaving them and working them to death and underfeeding them at that. But anyway, after they took the pig, this white boy, who was the neighbor, went over there to confront them. But by then, Gabriel Prosser was tired of bowing down to them and tap dancing and keeping his eyes to the ground. And when he refused to beg for forgiveness or tap dance for this white boy, the white boy got mad and it escalated into a fight. During the fight, Gabriel Prosser bit off a piece of the white boy's ear. And now, instead of being arrested for stealing a pig, he was now arrested for assaulting a white boy. Now, even though in Virginia, a black man harming a white boy was technically punishable by death, Gabriel Prosser was granted a benefit of clergy, which meant if he recited one Bible verse, he wouldn't get lynched or executed. Now, even though he recited the verse and wasn't killed, he was still severely punished. They still labeled him a felon. He was whipped and publicly humiliated and branded. Then he had to spend a month in prison. And then after that month, he went out back to the plantation. So I'm not really sure what the difference is. But anyway, Gabriel Prosser eventually met another enslaved brother named Jack Ditcher. And then together they began meeting with like-minded people on Sundays. And they usually gather at a place called Young Spring, which is now called Bryant Park. And with all of these like-minded people gathering every Sunday, they organize and plan ways to get their freedom and how to fight back. Now, one day after a funeral, Gabriel stood up and asked the others to join them, right, in their plan to kill all the white people who were slave owners or overseers. Now, I'm going to keep it real with you because it's something that we got to address as a people, right, because we seem to have this weakness. But he did not include, like the French and, white women and children and other people, only the slave owners and the overseers. But I tend to agree a lot more with Khalid Muhammad, but that's neither here nor there. But that's something that we got to address, this past that we love to give to everybody. But anyway, Gabriel's plan was to split into 3 groups. The first group was supposed to set a fire in the warehouse district to distract the militia. And while the militia was distracted in the warehouse district, the second group was supposed to go to the armory where they had somebody who was supposed to let them in. And once they armed themselves, they were supposed to meet with the third group who were coming from Petersburg. And they were going to meet at the Capitol to take the governor, James Monroe, hostage. Now understand, even though they were prepared to take their freedom by any means necessary, right, they still just wanted to negotiate for their freedom and for economic equality. Now, with us today, right, when are we going to learn that you can't negotiate with anybody for freedom or for economic equality? And you certainly can't negotiate with psychopaths. I'll put it the way that they put it so you'll feel more comfortable. We do not negotiate with terrorists. But as a blacksmith, Gabriel Prosser could make his own weapons, and he supplied a lot of weapons for the people. And they even created their own flag where they flipped the white boy Patrick Henry words, and the flag just said death or liberty. Now, unfortunately, the night that they were supposed to meet, it was a severe thunderstorm where the little creek that they were at started to flood, and it made it hard for them to pass. And because of the storm, so many people didn't even show up. Now, they say Gabriel, his wife Nanny, and Jack Ditcher still wanted to go along with the plans and get it popping right then and there, but they just didn't have enough people to carry out the mission. And I'm not gonna lie, I can hear it now, right? They probably was like, oh Lord, this rain is a sign from God that we don't need to be doing this. Oh Lord Jesus, look at all this rain. This ain't nothing but a sign. Hey y'all, this is a spot for Gabriel's rebellion. I guess they was planning it to start somewhere around here. 1800. Of course, Mosby Shepherd of Meadow Farms informed, Mosby Shepherd was a slave owner, but Tom and Farrell were the slaves that snitched. And, Governor Monroe called the militia and Gabriel his plans. But that brother never, folded or nothing like that. And if you look, they say, it was a heavy rainstorm and they couldn't cross it, right? But now it's a little bit different. What you see right here is a little pond or whatever. And I can hear them now. It's probably raining hard as hell. Just that little pond that they couldn't cross. Right, once it started raining hard as hell. And, Virginia, downtown is a long way away down there if you're walking, but all of this probably used to be the plantation all the way up there, past that light. All the way, there's a bunch of stores up there now, but if you look all the way up there, all this was likely plantation. As you see here, they was probably, sitting over here plotting. And what it looked like today. Yeah, maybe I'll show you other parts of the rebellion because there's a couple places throughout the city. And they executed them downtown. near the courthouse. Yeah, so he was executed, I think on October 6th, which is my birthday. And, I was born 187 years later. Okay, it said October 10th, but his trial was October 6th. It says here he was hung on October the 10th. But I know his trial, or he was hung on October 6th. So, that was my birthday. So we here to continue Gabrielle's rebellion. And we ain't gonna worry about no rain or nobody snitching on us. So I go to other spots. It's just one of the spots for Gabriel Prosser, but there's a bunch of spots here in Richmond, so I'm gonna go to more of them. But some people say that Gabriel Prosser had over 1,000 people in multiple counties around Virginia and surrounding Richmond ready to fight. But before they could meet the next day, 2 slaves named Pharaoh and Tom, who thought they were close with their master, warned them about the plan, I guess to protect him. And of course, the first thing he did was go tell authorities. And when James Madison heard about the plan, he sent the militia to Richmond to arrest and interrogate anybody he thought was involved. Now, Gabriel Prosser was able to escape, and he made it down to the James River, and he even found somebody who was willing to take him to Norfolk. But you can probably already guess how he got caught, right? 2 slaves, 2 brothers, supposed to be brothers, 2 enslaved men named Isham and Billy snitched to the authorities and told them about who Gabriel Prosser was and pointed him out. And then Gabriel Prosser and the boat captain were both arrested. Now, they held this sham trial on October 6, 1800, right, which happens to be my birthday, and Nat Turner was born October 2nd, 1800 in the same area. But anyway, they wanted Gabriel Prosser to tell them about what the plan was and to snitch on everybody involved. But Gabriel Prosser was a warrior, and he was never going to say nothing. That brother never said a word or showed them any fear or begged for mercy of any kind. He refused to give them the satisfaction. The only thing he did was request to be hung alongside everybody else who was hung for the same thing. And even though everybody who they suspected was involved was lynched on the same day, just to be the sick psychopaths they were, they took Gabriel Prosser to another location so he'd be lynched alone. And then they forced other slaves to watch the lynching, just to send them a message. But Gabriel Prosser went out like a true warrior. He didn't struggle, he didn't plead, he didn't cry, he didn't do anything but kept a straight face like a warrior and showed no fear. Gabriel Prosser refused to show any weakness, and he refused to give them the satisfaction of them enjoying them lynching him. And that brother was a true inspiration. And the thing is, nobody who was arrested ever snitched on anybody. It was just those 2 slaves, Pharaoh and Tom, who tried to tell their masters. And those other 2 slaves, Isham and Billy, who snitched on them. Nobody who they suspected was involved didn't say a word. The only brother who did say something basically said he was proud of what he did and he'd do it again. And like I try to say, right? He said, we not telling you nothing no different than George Washington told America, right? And I'm here to tell you today, they put George Washington on the side of a mountain. But I definitely honor the spirit of people like Gabriel Prosser or Mackendall or Queen Nanny or Queen Nzinga or any other warriors that we have seen so far and the warriors that we're still going to see. As far as the 2 slaves, Isham and Billy, who snitched, they were only given $50 as a reward, which wasn't even enough to buy their own freedom. And just as a comparison, the slave owner Thomas Prosser got $500 as compensation, aka reparations, for losing Gabriel Prosser as a slave. So the slave owner was compensated 50 times more than the 2 snitches, who probably remained enslaved for the rest of their life. But they wanted to bury the memory of Gabriel Prosser as fast as they could. And they tried to prevent people from even talking about him because they didn't want anybody to get that energy, that feeling of revolution.
I think for Gabriel, there's a moment in time, and that's when, in 1799, he and his brother, one of his friends, are stealing a neighbor's hog. And of course, most slaves are not getting enough protein on the table, and so slaves are always stealing, especially from neighbors, hogs, the occasional, cow, that kind of thing, and trying to get protein on the table. And he's caught, and the neighbor berates him, and of course he's supposed to then play the slave game, look down, shuffle his feet, apologize, be very obsequious, and he just kind of snaps, and he dives at the person's knees, and they have this kind of punching, rolling around on the ground contest going on, and he finally bites off the better part of the neighbor's left ear. So that's now a capital crime. He's attacked a white man.
He is arrested, and he would have been sentenced to death, but they have sort of a loophole that if you can recite passages from the Bible to show that you are God-fearing, then you would not be executed. You would be publicly whipped and humiliated, and then you would be branded with some kind of mark to forever label you as a person not quite trustworthy, that you had committed some kind of act against a white person.
It is difficult to say what would make a person take decisive action, especially when that action has such dire consequences, the possibility of dire consequences.
Because Gabriel is a skilled bondman who hires his time on occasion, he clearly knows people like himself at other estates. And because he is fairly mobile, when he's able to go to those estates, and he knows kind of who to contact. So in other words, he's dealing with people very much like himself.
He meets a fellow slave by the name of Jack Ditcher, and their personalities must have been similar. They were probably both very intelligent men, skilled men, and they discussed, maybe at first in jest, what could we do, and supposition of how can we end this life of servitude.
And so finally on August 10, they have this big meeting at Young Spring. It's a Sunday, and there's been a child's funeral, and so people have gathered. And Gabriel announces that anybody who's with him to stand up, and those who aren't just to keep sitting down. And of course, who's going to be sitting down while everybody else is rising up?
So the plan was to gather a group to march into Richmond on that Saturday, August 30th, as the sun was going down, that they would split into 3 formations. One would go to the warehouses along the river and set a fire, drawing the town's militia all there. Another group would go to the armory, where they had prearranged with the man who was in charge of the keys to the armory to let them in so that they could arm themselves, and then they were going to regroup as a solid group and move on the governor's mansion and take Governor Monroe hostage and negotiate for the end of slavery and access, basically, to the economic system.
Gabriel's skill at being a blacksmith enabled him to fashion weapons, makeshift weapons, that would be quite lethal. He could turn any of the plowshares, which you would use to turn the ground, which can be very sharp. He could turn them into weapons. Size that you use to cut wheat crops and such could be easily turned into weapons. Pikes could be made.
And there was a flag made, I understand, of silk that said death or liberty, inverting the words of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. And the fact that he inverted it to say death first signifies just how far they were willing to go in pursuit of freedom, in pursuit of liberty.
I think there's every reason to believe that the plan would have been successful. It might have been kind of a bloody mess in which Gabriel dies, or maybe Monroe dies, but it certainly had every possibility of getting off the ground, and then the skies just opened. And anyone who's ever been caught in a late summer rain in Virginia, it's not raining. I mean, it's pouring. What had been a tiny creek suddenly is a river. Small bridges near Brookfield are being washed away. Almost nobody gets to kind of the rendezvous point. According to one document, Nanny's there, Gabriel's there, Jack Ditcher's there, but not nearly enough men to start. And so they hold this kind of quick meeting and decide to push everything back for one night.
We believe there may have been at least 1,000 people involved. And when you have a group that large, it's not going to be as cohesive as you would like, because some began to doubt what they're doing.
You have a lot of people who have been holding themselves together in anticipation of this day and this hour. And when they have to delay, you can imagine that people begin to break.
Other slaves, the slaves that hadn't been able to meet there because of the terrible conditions of the weather, I'm sure they were thinking over again, is this really the best course for us to take? Is it worth the cost of what could happen? And one of those slaves is Pharaoh, and he lives here at Meadow Farm, and he's only 27 years old. He's got a wife and a young son, and I'm sure that this gave him great pause if he should go forward with this. So Pharaoh decides that he needs to speak to someone, and he goes to Tom, who is a fellow slave here at Meadow Farm. He's owned by Mosby Shepherd. And he suggests that they go and talk to Mosby Shepherd. That shows a level of trust that he has with his master, that they need to go speak with them.
And of course, one of the ways that any slave society exists is by offering incentives to those who have useful information. And they finally do decide to go and tell their owner, Mosby Shepherd, of what's going on, and he is able to get word into town. He writes something out. He also kind of gallops into town and gets word to Monroe, who then calls out the militia in Henrico and the area all around Richmond, and that's when Gabriel finally decides to run for it.
And it leads him to the James River, and he's able to find a sympathetic captain there that has a ship named Mary. And on the ship are also slaves that he knows. So he feels a degree of safety that he can escape. He's able to board the ship. The ship will take him to Norfolk.
And when they get there, there is a reward that Governor Monroe has posted. And so there's a slave on the ship. He doesn't want to turn Gabriel in, but the reward could possibly buy his freedom. And so he notifies authorities in Norfolk, and they board the ship and take Gabriel away. And in the final kind of classic irony of ironies, because the person who turns him in is a black man, he only gets part of the reward and not enough to buy his own freedom.
And it is there that he is apprehended and brought back in chains to Richmond to stand trial. October 6th is the date for his trial, but it's really a farce. All of the individuals that are there know that this is just once again the whites saying one thing and will do another. I'm sure they wanted him to confess and say, I was wrong, I'm so sorry. But he was a proud man, and he was not going to do that. At the end of the trial, of course, he was found guilty. And for him to be executed, he's a slave. So for you to execute a slave means you have to reimburse the master that owns him. So the value of $500 is placed upon him that will be paid to his owner.
When Gabriel and his men are hanged, they're hanged in very strategic places. Some are hanged in Brookfield, so that they bring slaves, and masters will force their slaves to come and watch. So these are very public executions. So some are executed in Richmond, some out in Henrico, some in front of the tavern that Prosser owns. They want as many slaves to see this is the price of thinking about armed freedom and liberation. And so the fact that no one dies is irrelevant. They have to make an example.
One of the things that Gabriel had asked, a dying man's request, was that he not be hung alone, that he would have his friends with him that had been sentenced to death also. But when he is taken by cart to the execution site, he realizes he will have that final insult of his wish not being followed through, that he will have to die alone.
And so, yeah, so the man who's at the center of this vast conspiracy dies by himself. He dies in Richmond, so probably Nanny is not there to see him die, and any kind of comfort that he might have derived from that to see her there in the audience. And then, of course, the gallows is the old Negro burial ground, and so you hang him and then plant him right there. The body does not go back to the family. There's no last rites for the family to grieve. He just kind of disappears, and word arrives that he's been hanged. I think especially when it became clear how vast it was, that it was not just a handful of slaves in Henrico, but that it finally essentially had branches from Henrico to Norfolk to Petersburg. A handful of slaves apparently in Charlottesville knew about it. It doesn't mean they're actively involved, but they knew about it and kept silent. And I think that's kind of what really stunned America.
The laws became much more restrictive. You began to see much fewer manumissions and emancipations. Laws were created that said once you became free, you had to leave the state. You could not be educated, you could not own firearms, you could not gather in an assembly. It was with the intention of keeping people in their place.
And we are known for our founding fathers from Virginia, and they all asked the same question that Gabriel asked. And they're remembered in our pantheon of history, whereas Gabriel is often unnoted and looked over his story when it resonates, I think, with everyone.
And Virginia ended up passing a law where free Negroes had to leave the state within a certain time, or they were subject to be enslaved or re-enslaved. Of course, they passed stricter slave laws, including laws against reading and writing or being educated at all, right? And we already know what would happen if they caught somebody reading and writing. They poke out your eyeballs, cut out your tongue, cut off your limbs, castrate you, whatever they felt. That's why it's important for us to understand our history. It's been illegal for us to read in this country longer than it has been legal for us to go to their public schools. But of course, after Gabriel Prosser, right, enslaved people were forbidden from gathering together. And of course, you already know every black person was forbidden from arming themselves. And this is with anything that could be considered a weapon. But we'll end the lesson right there. But it's important that we understand about people like Gabriel Prosser. We understand about a lot of things that disrupted or stopped the rebellions meant to free us. It's important to realize that petitioning or begging somebody else for your freedom is never going to get you what you want. Because at the end of the day, this same group of people, whether in the South or the North, have no problem with lynching 2 black girls because of a suspected fire, right? And they don't even know how it started. But this is the reason why we have to be on code and work together. But I appreciate everybody for listening. I appreciate everybody who support this. And I encourage you to go make your own course in whatever it may be. Because if we don't educate ourselves and then educate our children, the same thing is going to keep happening over and over. And at the end of the day, we are all we got. Now, we'll get into more of the Haitian Revolution on the next session. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. You know what I'm saying? And so I appreciate y'all again and thank y'all. And as always, man, we have got to start standing for something or we're going to keep falling for anything.